Okay. I'd like to call this meeting to order. We're on air. Thank you very much. Quiet on the set, please. Appreciate it. Today, I'm green. I'm good. Today is July 20th, 2021. I'm Paul Johnson. This is the meeting of the Legislative Committee of the City of Middletown. And I will start by calling the roll. Alderman Massey.
Here.
Alderman Burr. Here. And Macers, Tobin, and Ramkissoon are not here. We still have three. That's a quorum. We're still allowed to do stuff. And you have one resolution before you. I'm told very briefly by the mayor that this has something to do with background checks for rentals to be in conformance with national and or federal protocols or regulations. And Mr. Smith, yes. It's your party. You can cry if you want to.
Well, I'm sure you all saw the letters that went back and forth from the NAACP, and I think there was the NYU legal staff, and we had some pretty strong discourses for a while, and we came to a compromise, though. Well, I wouldn't call it a compromise. We came to what I think has to be. And one thing I will admit that they taught me that I didn't know was that criminal background checks are, in large part, regulated by something called the Federal Credit Reporting Act. Now, I wouldn't have thought that the Credit Reporting Act had anything to do with background checks, but it does. It was passed quite a few years ago, and it, as originally passed, was limited to you couldn't use them at all. Then they must have had a lot of complaints, must have had problems, and said that the background checks, they took away they made a limit of 7 years is all you could look back. So in other words, the law became you can only ask for a background check 7 years back. You ask for one further than that, you're violating federal law. Well, that caused more problems than the original, and the federal government, some years afterwards, and this is documented in cases around the country, there was a lot of litigation. The federal government went back, and now the federal act is you can look back as many years as you want for a criminal background check. New York State, however, which controls us, this is not preempted by the federal government. New York State's Fair Credit Reporting Act, its version of it, is limited to 7 years. And under the general business law in the state of New York, you cannot ask for a report, and you cannot get a report, you cannot generate a report that goes back more than 7 years, or you're violating New York state law. I checked it out, and sure enough, there it was. There has not yet been any litigation on it. There's been a lot of litigation over the federal act. I didn't find any litigation over the New York State Act, but I can't quarrel with what's there in black and white. It's limited to 7 years. So I don't see how I can, in good faith, suggest to the council not do what's in there. And it's as simple as that.
Okay, well, thank you for that succinct.
I mean, let's be honest about where we were with this. They didn't like them at all. The lawyers that were contacting me and contacting council and the mayor, those lawyers were advocating that we eliminate background checks completely because they can be used as a form of discrimination. And for that, the solution we reached on that was to provide the HUD guidelines on how not to discriminate by using background checks to our landlords. And I have no problem with that. It's pretty simple to use, and it is the guidance that the national government uses and people use all around the country. So I have no problem with that. They wanted us to eliminate them completely. I don't think that's a good idea. And I told them flat out over the phone that I don't think New York State's 7-year look back is enough. I think people should be allowed to look back further, especially for certain types of violent felonies. But the law doesn't make any distinctions, and I think we have to live with it. We have no choice.
Okay, well, having said that, I kind of originally looked at this as a little bit of a pro forma conversation, which is why I allocated 15 minutes for this committee meeting. but it may be more involved than that. We can always have another meeting. I'm going to start with Mr. Massey because I know he has some particular questions that he articulated to me privately.
Thank you, Alex. And a couple things. One, who does the background? Two, who pays for it? Three, where does the information go? If I happen to be a landlord of a 2-family or 3-family house, do I get the information? And I'm a little concerned. My first answer, if you'd answer those 3 questions.
Sure. We're not changing any of that. That's been in place in Middletown for the past few years. The city does not get the information. The landlord provides proof that they ordered it. You order it typically from companies that are all around the country. You can get them online. They do their checks, excuse me, and they provide them to the landlord. Landlord pays. Landlord then can use that to make a decision about whether or not to rent.
The
We do
information
not
go-
get involved in that
The
whatsoever.
information goes to whom?
The landlord.
All right, thank you.
And if I remember the discussion we had back then, the landlord is not obligated to act in a particular manner based upon the outcome of the background check. Is that true?
Correct. The landlord cannot discriminate under the federal guidance, and the federal guidance explains how you don't do that. You don't use the background checks as a motive or as an excuse to discriminate. You can't do that.
So in your mind, what are we using it for?
We're using it to give people an idea of whether or not they may be renting to people who've been convicted of a serious crime in the past 7 years. Landlords can use it in terms of, the credit, the ability to pay.
Okay.
They can use it legitimately for that. The city's purpose in establishing it was because, as I said some years ago, we were getting an awful lot of excuses in city court when landlords were brought in for violating various city codes. Well, it's not me, it's my tenant. Well, you're responsible for your tenant, is what we had to explain to people. And in part of that discussion, often included some of the judges that were over there over the years. Why don't you check that out before you rent it to somebody?
Gotcha.
And as a matter of fact, there were a couple of cases in which the judge, as a part of, say, the guilty plea compromise, landlord would plead guilty to violating the code, and the judge would order, as part of the conditional discharge, which is good for a year, that from now on, for the next year, before you rent, you've got to get a background check. So you don't come into court with that kind of excuse again.
Okay, good answer.
Alex, when you say it's not discriminatory, you get a background check. What determines, each landlord determines what they'll accept?
Yes, it's up to the landlord.
In other words, I might accept someone that was in jail for
Something.
a non-theft or a non-destruction, and the guy who owns the house next to me might not allow anyone that's ever been. So it is I view that as it is somewhat discriminatory.
And that's what the HUD guidance is for. The HUD guidance explains how you don't discriminate, and sometimes it's very difficult to prove. That's why these cases can be, the discrimination cases can be very difficult, because how do you prove that somebody is using the background check to discriminate? Somebody has a hatred toward a certain ethnic group or something like that and gets a background check. Well, if you get, let's say he's got 5 prospective tenants and 4 of them are from a certain ethnic background, and all 5 have criminal records, and the 4 that are of the ethnic background have the least severe. You 4 aren't getting it. Well, I think that's a use of the background check that's probably discriminatory, and that's what the HUD guideline warns you about. It's a difficult, it can be very
Sounds
difficult.
like a slippery slope. I think ironically, if I was a landlord and I didn't have the background check, I would be less likely to be accused of discrimination because I had no idea what the background was. So,
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Burrow, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation as our 3rd committee member. What would you like to say?
I'm pretty good with the information that comes out.
Yeah, let me just add one more thing. The mayor just reminded me, and it was something I told the council years ago when we first passed this, and another reason, and I made an argument with the lawyers from NYU as well, that in other types of cases, say where there's been an attack, a violent attack on another tenant, or on a neighbor. The lawyer who's representing the neighbor or the victim of the attack, the other tenant, is going to be looking for people to sue. And people have sued landlords for putting dangerous people in proximity to other tenants and neighbors. And one of the defenses a landlord will typically use, well, wait a minute, I did a background check, I did what I could, and I did my due diligence. And if you don't do it, what I told the NYU lawyers is, you're giving up that defense down the road if you don't use a background check. And they didn't have any argument with that other than, well, that's those cases. So, it can lead to difficult litigation. There's no doubt about that. But I think that the solution we've come up, first of all, it puts us in compliance with New York state law. That's the most important thing. And it gives city landlords the ability to do some checking to see over the past 7 years if there's been serious convictions and to use it wisely.
So you stand by your recommendation, obviously.
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, do you recommend that we adopt this as a council?
I do. I think you're maybe getting off track a little bit on the basis of whether we should have the
Right.
the background checks. Now, they're in place now. We're not changing any of that. We're just becoming probably less. I think, right, Alex? Our prior enforcement policies were more stringent than the law allowed. But I think the background check it also protects the landlord, and it eliminates a defense in court. And we usually work with landlords on a lot of issues. When we have a problem tenant, we've adjusted water bills for landlords that have had a problem tenant. We've gone easier on code enforcement in court when they can demonstrate that they're taking an action against the tenant. And this is just another, when someone can show the city attorney that they followed all the protocols and they still have a bad tenant, then we go a little bit less on them. So I do recommend that we go through with it.
Okay, thank you. Keeping in mind I need to finish in 4.5 minutes, I'm going to go to the cheap seats. Alderman Green, what say you?
I say we go forward with it. I agree with it. As long as we're in line with the law, there's nothing wrong with me, so we're good.
Alderman Jean-Francois?
I think 7 years is enough time to do it. I don't see any issue with that at all.
Alderman Kleiner?
We all got the email. We knew there were issues and questions about it, and we all said that's for Alex to figure out, because we didn't know. And so we expected something along this line, and I think it's a pretty good solution for now.
Thank you very much. I'll go back to the committee members. Mr. Burr, you okay if we move forward with this?
Let's move forward.
Mr. Massey, you okay if we move forward?
Let's go.
Okay, as am I. So the committee passes this on to the Common Council. What would the next part of this process be, Mr. Numchuck?
It'll be up for a vote at the next meeting.
No public hearing, nothing like that?
Unless you guys want to do a public hearing.
Just asking, not requesting.
I don't.
Okay, well, thank you very much for keeping us on track. And I will now ask that we conclude this committee meeting.
It's in the zoning law, is it not? Can you check the resolution? Do you have it in front of you?
Does this change the zoning?
If it's in the zone, if the rental permits are in the zoning law.
Right.
Or I think though it's in the housing law, the Middletown housing law. If it's
So-
in the housing law, we don't have to change it.
Right.
All right, but you and I can check that.
I'll check that, yes.
Okay, thank you all very much for your cooperation. I need a motion to close this committee meeting.
So moved.
Mr. Massey?